Hello and welcome to the Bodyline Pro podcast. My name is Isaac Osborne, founder and CEO of Bodyline Pro. In this podcast, we interview practitioners who use Bodyline Pro and some of the leading experts in the health industry who are committed to taking a scientific approach to improving the form and function of the body and the growth and development of their practice. This podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. Be sure to check out the show notes for links. For more information about Bodyline Pro, visit bodylinepro.com. Welcome to episode 10 of the Bodyline Pro podcast. In this episode, our guest is Gil Hedley, Ph.D. Gil is the founder of Integral Anatomy Productions and Somanauts Workshops Incorporated. For over 20 years, he has been guiding thousands of somanauts in the exploration of the human form through cadaver dissection. He created the word somanaut to describe those who explore the inner space of the body and discover the rich terrain of themselves. His publications include the Integral Anatomy series, as well as a number of books. You can find more info about Gil in the show notes, a link to his website, gilhedley.com, and some YouTube videos that he has done as well, but you can also find those on his website. During the recording of this episode, we encountered video issues and ended up only being able to record audio. So for those of you watching on YouTube, enjoy the galaxy flying through space that's behind me right now, and as you listen to the episode. So in this episode, what do Gil and I talk about? We talk about what's in between the layers of fascia. I don't want to really say much more because if you're not familiar with it, this is an eye-opening experience, and I encourage you to really explore Gil's YouTube channel and his website and possibly even do one of his workshops. It's very enlightening material and what he's discovered, and I think that what he has done is come closest to anybody explaining why connective tissue restricts, why it's becoming so restricted. So without further ado, here's Gil. Hey Gil, welcome to the show. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. I've been a big fan of yours for a really long time. Welcome to the show.
Wow, thank you very much, Isaac. I appreciate the chance to chat with you.
So you've had actually maybe way more than you know, a huge influence on my practice.
Well, and definitely more than I. Tell me how and why and what do you do?
Well, I do structural integration, and I've been in practice. I've been in practice now. I've been in bodywork practice now for going on 19 years.
Wow.
And I came across your Integral Anatomy series pretty soon after it first came out. I think it was in 2003, 2004, maybe earlier.
It was a little later than that, actually. I published the first couple volumes in 2005, and then another one in 2006 or 7, and the last one came out in 2009. But word of what I was doing, has been. I started doing the dissections way back in 94 or something like that, so 95.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So the structural community was aware of me because I was part of that community for a while. Right.
Well, I came across your videos around that time. Maybe it was around 2004. Maybe it was around 2005 that I came across your videos, and I had already trained in structural integration at that point. And I had been a yoga practitioner or studying yoga. I never actually got official training in teaching yoga. And I also worked at a physical therapy clinic for a while. And movement was, I was kind of torn. I was torn between movement and the idea of manipulating fascia. And your video, the Fuzz speech, really was a huge turning point for me with what your discovery was with the fuzz. And I'll put a link.
Mm-hmm.
I'll put a link into the show notes for those that maybe have not seen the video. And it for me, it made so much sense. It made so much sense. It really brought light to what I was experiencing when I worked with tissue, people's connective tissue on the table, and what my mentor Emmett Hutchins was talking about, layers and how layers should slide over each other, and so it really gave this visual of the what's happening to the body when we get these restrictions. And the movement.
Well, I have to say that the tour I just did gave an update of the Fuzz speech in a major way, because I've learned a tremendous amount since I published it. And some of that learning I put in the most cursory way in annotations, because my feeling at one point was either I got to take this thing down, or I got to annotate it, or I got to update it somehow. And so I annotated it because that was the easiest thing to do on a YouTube thing. Just write a few words over the images to say, hey, I've learned a few things since here. But the tour that I just did was basically 4 hours of visual update from the lab, explaining my most current understanding of what I was talking about then, when I didn't have as much of a base to go on, and I had certain misunderstandings that I was still tangled in, because it takes a while to sort out the human body, especially when you're dealing with the bits that didn't make it into the book.
Right. And so that's actually one of my questions for you is you got a lot of backlash for the Fuzz speech. Is that correct?
Not a lot. There's a couple of haters out there who go off about it, and that's fine. I mean, I've talked to those people, and I'm like, hey, you don't even know what you're talking about. I can criticize it better than you can. Why don't you look at some of my other stuff? Because I've been correcting it for all these years. But they're like, it's much more fun to have a straw man to beat up than to actually, understand a work in its context, and to see a person's learning curve and to learn from it with them. So, that's kind of how, that's the thing there.
And what was the argument that was being presented? Where did it fall apart?
Well, I get all kinds of people saying crazy stuff. Oh, it's only in the dead, or it grows there once they're dead, or whatever. And I'm like, no, there are the tissue is definitely in different states, between the living and the dead, between the fixed and the unfixed. Yes, there's different states, but the material is basically, it's the same stuff. It's not like it is some kind of fairy that waves a wand in there and makes something appear. But what the fuzz is that I was showing, in the imagery online, is nothing more than the membranous interfaces that live within the surfaces of all of our tissues, which, I called it fuzz for about 10 years. And it ended for me at the Fuzz speech. And from then on, I pretty much called it filmy fascia. But filmy fascia isn't really a scientific word either. It's more of a textural word that makes sense to structural people like you and me. But since the last couple of years, and along this tour, I've started referencing this material that's in the body as Peri Fascia, meaning the fascia around the fascia, basically, because we have certain layers that were identified, say, in our trainings, yours with Emmett and mine, whatever, at the Rolf Institute, and then so those layers, whatever, skin, superficial fascia, deep fascia, there's something missing there. There's more layers, and once you get into the body and dissect it for a couple of decades, it starts to be in your face. Oh my gosh, there's more stuff here that didn't make the book, that didn't make the story, even of the people doing this kind of work. And I called it fuzz at first and wasn't so sure it belonged there. Now I know that it belongs there, but the question is, what's its condition? So the tissues that I showed in the Fuzz speech absolutely belong there, number one. Number two, when I demonstrate them in a fixed cadaver, meaning it's been embalmed, the tissues are desiccated. And so when you pull apart membranes that have a kind of a felted collagenous fiber matrix, they look like cotton candy when you pull them apart, but they're not cotton candy. They're a membrane. So when you lay them back down, they do form, a membranous interface between the tissues that are being pulled apart. And that interface is the means whereby differential movement is accomplished anatomically speaking. So when you have total connection and differential movement, which connected bit moves, so you have to have like a distensible material, and that's what this fuzz stuff is. It's a membrane that, in its happy, healthy, wet, moist, slippery fascial state, permits a certain amount of excursion between the tissues in their differential movement, not an infinite amount of excursion, but a certain amount that's appropriate for the range of motion of the tissues, and at which point, at the end of that range of motion, like anything, it kind of locks out, and then you go back into, and when you're not having the distensible moment, it's more of a sort of a gelatinous mucoidal interface that basically, allows the movement. So the fuzz, as I first understood it, was like a limit cycle on movement. I was a romper. I was told that there was supposed to be silk stockings in there slipping on one another. As far as I'm concerned, when you look at the anatomical charts catalog picture of the muscles, it looks like they're all separate and independent, right? Mm-hmm. And that they should be kind of wet and slippery on each other with no sort of fascial connection between them. But that's a false image and a mistaken metaphor. Basically, what's true about the body is that it's completely sort of solid in there, but the textures change. And those changes in textures are what enable movement to happen. And we identify by name those changes in textures and say, the skin, and then we have superficial fascia. Well, the skin and the superficial fascia, there's no differential movement between them, right? In other words, they're just, they move together, right? The skin is the skin of the fatty layer underneath it. Mm-hmm. But the fatty layer itself isn't universally fixed into the deep fascia beneath it. No, at many points, in fact, we have excursions so that you can do something like skin rolling, right? And that sort of behavior is a demonstration of the fact that there's a membrane underneath it. At other places, the tissue is fixed. You don't do skin rolling on the palm of your hand or on the sole of your feet, right? Right. Because the superficial fascia is fixed into the deep fascia in a way that enables you to grip. But in the places, say, along the forearm or along the lower leg, you can go shluck, 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 and you can move your skin and superficial fascia to a certain degree, right, over the deep fascia. And that movement is mediated by what I first called fuzz, then called filmy fascia, and now called Peri Fascia. And I can dissect it out as a fascia, show it to you in multiple sheets, in multiple areas of the body, over and over again, quite consistently. I know what I'm talking about now, finally. When I first encountered it, I was like, what the hell is that doing there? It's not in the book. Matter didn't draw it. No one was talking about it. And so I thought, well, maybe this is the aberrant, binding of tissues that I'm supposed to differentiate with my manual therapy or with my movement work. But that's not really the case. What's true is that all the tissues are connected, and then we have to ask, what's the condition of those tissues? Is the condition of the tissues conducive to differential movement, or have restrictions been introduced to those tissues that reduce the potential for movement in this shearing interface that I'm calling fuzz/filmy fascia/perifascia? Are you getting the picture?
Yeah, absolutely. That was an amazing description of it, and your depth of knowledge is I just love it. I love hearing you talk. So
we barely scratched the surface. You want to hear about the popes? I wrote a dissertation on them. This is just my hobby. This is a sidelight. Everyone thinks I'm a fascia guy, you know. I'm not really a fascia guy. I'm an anatomy guy. I'm into the whole body, you know. I'm into the whole world. So I'm into the, you know, the body at large, you know, the planet, the universe, and this, you know, the funny focus on fascia has provided a platform for which I'm massively grateful, because the interest in fascia gives me a chance to talk about everything else. So.
Right. Well, I personally think that you're on the leading edge of really uncovering
the abyss.
Of the abyss, absolutely, of uncovering, you know, just much more explanation of what we're doing.
Yeah. Well, I do feel like I do feel like you know, Ida Rolf asked Jim Oshman, you know, tell us what we're doing. And Jim Oshman spent, you know, his whole life trying to basically get a grip on what we're doing. And he did it from like an energetic advantage. And I'm deeply grateful for all the amazing things that Jim Oshman has brought forward. I've learned so much from him. And I've tried to sort of do the same thing, but from an anatomical perspective. So like, what am I doing when I'm leaning on somebody, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
I have so much of a better sense of that now, because we use those terms in our training. Differentiate the gastroc from the soleus. Well, what does that mean in the mind of a person who's never done any dissection? To me, it meant get it unstuck, you know, and pick one thing off of another thing as if there were two things there, right? But there aren't two things there. There's no such thing as a gastroc and a soleus. Those are literally mental constructs. And what we have is a meat leg, right, which is part of a meat body, and it's all a piece. And then the question is, how is it possible that we can move? We're not a tree, right? We're not a block of wood. There's no differential movement in a tree or in a block of wood. And we have differential movement. It's astonishing and puzzling at the same time, because we go into it, you know, without really a sense of how that happens. And so when you press on somebody, you know, I had been told the story, whatever, of the thixotropic effect, right?
Yeah.
Maybe you've told that story where there's a shift from you know, gel to sol that's induced by manual pressure and the heat that it generates, which changes the state of what we were considering the deep fascia, right, in such a way that it becomes a moldable plastic medium and you can do stuff with it, right? So I was told that story, and I worked accordingly. I worked accordingly, and it's simply not true. And that's fine. In other words, we tell lots of ridiculous stories about what we're doing that aren't true. It doesn't mean the work isn't good. You know, the work is good, but under a different story, the work might be tweaked a little bit, right? So, you know, the metaphor you carry into your body work is very important. So if you think you're, you know, using your hands to induce the thixotropic effect, they're probably going to be heavier hands than are required for the task.
Yes.
You know, because the thixotropic effect requires basically the pressure of an elephant to induce it in the deep fascia, and that's unlikely to register. You know, so when I was at the Rolf Institute, Robert Schleip was like, "Hey, you know, you're not elephants. I don't think you're inducing the thixotropic effect. I don't exactly know what we're doing here." And so that put me, you know, back a few steps, and I had thought for many years, you know, what are we doing? And what I realized we were doing was that we've been working all this time on a fascial layer that we didn't account for. That wasn't part of our mental construction of the body that we were working on, right? So if you don't know that there's this filmy layer, right? And maybe it needs some conditioning, maybe it needs some deagglomeration, maybe it needs some hydration, maybe it needs some loving contact, right? Well, you're going to do that accidentally while you're reaching for mashing on some filmy fascia. And the filmy fascia will respond in short order to your touch in a way that the deep fascia is frankly incapable. And so what we did was ascribe properties to the deep fascia that it doesn't have. Right, and that's why someone will say, well, you can't stretch the deep fascia, and they'll get all bent out of shape and tell Rolfers they're not doing anything. Well, it's a mixed truth. The deep fascia is definitely not as distensible nor as speedily responsive as these membranes, which are very distensible and speedily responsive. So all these years, I would say Rolfers has been working on the Fuzz, working on the filmy fascia, the perifascial membranes, hydrating them, deagglomerating them, bringing them back online, bringing people's consciousness more deeply into their body, right? But they haven't been molding and stretching deep fascia on the spot. That's just not the case.
And that's because
I don't think that's a justifiable theory. I don't think that we are inducing the thixotropic effect in the deep fascia. And also, I always thought, well, if I'm doing all this molding in deep fascia, I ought to see very different deep fascia in the body, right? So I've dissected hundreds of bodies at this point, and I can tell you before I cut them, like which fiber direction I'm going to see underneath there, because it's extremely predictable anatomy. There's a nose in the middle of your face, there's two eyes on the side, there's a head on top, there's feet on bottom, and there's these certain hatch patterns that you're going to find in the deep fascia over and over and over again. So I'm thinking, well, the behavior of this 90-year-old lady and this 50-year-old guy was probably different, and yet I see the same patterns in the deep fascia. So I have a feeling that my touch is not particularly transformational, right, of that particular patterning. However, I can change its tone over time, right? If I adjust the way a person uses their body, their deep fascia will change its tone, and that change of tone will change shape, pattern, movement, all very important. So I'm not saying you can't change deep fascia, but what I am saying is that you're not friggin' molding it, changing the fiber direction. You're just not doing that.
Would you say that the deep fascia is more changed by, say, movement work such as Feldenkrais, yoga, Pilates, weightlifting, etc.?
It's not more changed by any of those, or it's not more or less changed. What it is it's a follower, not a leader.
Okay.
Okay, so that the position and tone of the deep fascia, as far as I can tell, follows usage. Right? And by position, I mean it can get little wrinkles in it. There's not big change. It doesn't go from here to there. That's what's particularly characteristic about the movement of the deep fascia, is that it's not particularly moving. It does move a little bit, but it's like exoskeletal. It's connected directly to the skeleton through septa, and as a consequence, it's the more stable element in the fascial movement system relative to the membranes, which are shearing above and below the deep fascia and within the muscle layer. So the real movie part of the fascial system are these membranes, and the more stable part is the deep fascia. And that's why I kind of get a little bent when people are constantly trying to change their deep fascia in order to get movement. It's not quite like that. It's more like you get movement to change the deep fascia. And it will then, over time, right, change its tone to express the new movement pattern. But grinding away on your IT band because you're saying it's tight, it better be tight. It's holding your body together, So people love to murder their IT bands. Well, they do, because it's from that pain means gain mentality, and you can poke your finger in the eye too, and then stop, and it feels really good. So people do that kind of thing.
So the more morphine, quick change, so to speak, in the fascia and the body would be the superficial fascia, is also what you're saying. Well, so to speak.
No, actually, not quite.
Not quite. Okay.
The filmy fascia, the membrane, the superficial fascia is membrane. Is the fatty layer. I'm talking about the membranous layer between the superficial and the deep. It's not really accounted for anywhere. I called it the Fuzz at one time. I don't call it the Fuzz anymore. I mean, that was just literally an expression that came out of my mouth when I was taking the body apart, and I was like, well, what's this cotton candy? It looks fuzzy. That's all. And I just played with it. I've been playing with it for years because whatever, people like fuzzy things. They like teddy bears and et cetera, fuzzy places in their body. It's just a nice thing.
So is the Peri Fascia correct? That's really changing between the layers. That's what
I believe that. That's the story I'm telling these days. Let's put it that way. And I'm sure it can be undone in future days. But as far as I can tell, as best as I can say right now, I've made up this word perifascia to describe this felted, slippery, transparent, membranous interface that's present wherever there is differential movement in the body, right?
Yeah.
If something is moving in the musculoskeletal system, there will be present this stuff. Now, there are different tales about what is called. People will call it different things. Because I call my work integral anatomy, I tend to like to pick one word per texture. Right? So instead of naming a bunch of muscles, I just say muscle. That's muscle. You know what I'm saying? And and deep fascia is that more dense, regular fibrous fascia. Superficial fascia is that whole adipose layer surrounding the body. And this filmy fascia, they're each different textures, right? So superficial fascia is kind of spongy, and the membranes are kind of slippery. The perifascial membranes are kind of slippery, and the deep fascia is kind of bouncy, trouncy, and dense, relatively speaking. They're all palpable. This is something that anybody can touch their body and feel these different textures and note their movement properties. I mean, superficial fascia, you couldn't move unless it moved either. Because if your fatty layer has gone dense and doesn't have differential movement in itself, you're not going anywhere either. So the lobules of the superficial fascia need to be movable relative to itself, or else you can't have nice wave conduction going through it. When you take a step, it would be jarring, right? So you need to have wave motion going through your body, in addition to force conduction along whatever vectors of joint planes, etc.
Right. And I was lucky enough to see you when you came here to Santa Barbara, and your work with the superficial fascia was just absolutely amazing. How you remove the adipose or the fat from. It sounded like so much work that it took to do that. And then showing the superficial fascia without the adipose layer was absolutely fascinating in how incredibly strong also it was. Yeah,
it's shockingly strong. I think that I'll be demonstrating that footage when I'm at the Fascia Congress in Berlin later in the year.
Oh, fantastic!
Because I really think that's important. That people see it, that they get a sense like, oh, this isn't just some weird inert stuff that's not supposed to be there. No, this and it's not merely a loose areolar connective tissue that I also called it for years, because that's what anatomists call it. That's what I learned. So I called it a loose areolar connective tissue. But when I test it, it's not so loose and areolar. It's friggin' strong as can be. That's funny you were at the Santa Barbara talk, because that was literally, it was a 46 city tour, and Santa Barbara was the physical low. I had a terrible cold. I was sick as could be. I was sick as a dog. I can't believe I conveyed anything at that talk. So I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I got a lot out of it, and I really appreciated you coming here. You were great. So it was. Okay. I didn't even know yet. I think you actually mentioned you were. I thought you said you were getting over a cold, but I can't remember exactly.
No, it literally had just hit me. I had been just on this grinding work schedule. Just drive a day, teach a day, drive a day, teach a day. I was utterly exhausted, and after I taught San Francisco, I just came down with a wicked cold on my way to Santa Barbara. And like every time I took a break, I was like bent down behind a podium, blowing my nose.
Well, I was so engrossed in what you were talking about, I didn't notice.
That's awesome. I appreciate that feedback. So I think I just gave you like 90% of what I said in that talk in about 18 minutes. How about that? He can really talk fast.
Yeah, you did. But I also, I wish that you had the visuals that you had in that talk that, I mean, obviously can't do it because
of course. Well, I am going to share
conversation.
those, but I'm going to create, I'm actually doing it now. I mean, I'm working on cutting up the footage that I shot because I did shoot the talks, you know, and some of them, of course, came out better than other in terms of lighting or audio or screen positioning or what have you. So I'm presently shopping footage so that I can basically compile the same story from the footage, and then I'll put that up as an online course sooner than later. I'm working on it day by day now.
Oh, that's great. I'm excited about it.
So it's going to be out there, and that way people can, whatever, you know, I'll do it somehow, or you can, I don't know, rent it forever or rent it for a month so people can watch the course and either get credit or just have it as a reference.
Sure. Yeah. Please let me know when that's available.
Yeah, for sure.
So I approached you with a little bit. I don't know if you remember. I probably don't. I approached you with a little bit of a theory about fascia, and
okay, what was it? Tell me, remind me.
So my experience of working with connective tissue has been especially applying movement, and when I first noticed this was right around when I first came across your video series, and this is why it's had such a huge impact on my practice. And it was the Fuzz speech, and you were talking about movement, and if you have loss of movement in that area, then the fuzz grows and gets sticky and doesn't allow the Peri Fascia, doesn't allow for movement between the layers of the superficial fascia and the deep fascia and so forth.
Yeah. So I'm going to pause you for 1 second for the sake of the listeners and say, yes, to the extent of, think about like hydrogen bonding and cross-linking of the felted collagen fibers in the slippery membranes. So the slippery membranes can basically get less slippery, and that's a chemical change and a structural change. But it's not a permanent change because we can reclaim the slipperiness. Those bonds can get unbonded, those get unlinked. The tissue can become slippery again. And so keep going.
Okay. So I took this woman. She was a client. She came to me with neck pain. She worked at a desk all day long. She had kyphosis, or for those listeners that don't know, it's a very rounding in the thoracic spine. And right around her, I took her through the 10 sessions. She felt a lot better afterwards. A lot of her neck pain disappeared, and she came to see me about once a month after we finished the 10 sessions to get tune-ups. And the area that I consistently worked on through the 10 and then afterwards with those tune-ups were the area just beneath or right around the bra line, right around the xiphoid process, in her rib cage, on the front of her rib cage. She would get this sheet of tissue that was just so restricted, and every time I worked on it, she would have relief. Her posture would change, and then she would come back a month later, and that tissue would be the same. So then once I saw your video and just studying all these other corrective exercises, and I gave her a program to do. I didn't see her for about 6 months, 8 months, and she came back to see me, and I said, "Oh, hey, how you been doing?" And she's like, "I've been doing great. I just came back to kind of like say hi." And I went to go work in that tissue area again. Besides noticing that she hadn't had neck pain, and her posture wasn't really that bad, but I went to check that tissue and it was fluffy. It was no longer that density that it was before. Nice. so my question is does that area respond? Well, obviously it responds, but what's happening there that the body is saying, okay, we need to reinforce this, because obviously in that same area there's muscle contraction. There is shortening and muscle contraction in that area where physically on her back, the spinal erector muscles were not engaged. They weren't awake. If you look at Thomas Hanna's work, and he talks about sensory motor amnesia, essentially those muscles forgot to work, so to speak. So does the perifascia scaffold and build itself up in areas on opposite sides of the body where muscles aren't working? So on the front it's a flexion movement, so she's always in this flexion movement. Her back, her spine doesn't ever get a proper extension, so the muscles of the front are constantly working harder, and that creates more perifascia. I don't know, I'm curious to.
No, it's that it creates more perifascia, but I talked in a talk about inflammation and dehydration and stasis. So basically, wherever you're not exercising your birth rate of differential movement, you're going to get a little stuck. And so it's not that we're going to get more layers of perifascia, but what we're going to get is a quality of tissue texture that's suboptimal from its ideal slipperiness. And that's going to be accompanied by all kinds of other patterning, right? The muscle tone, the tone of the deep fascia, the density even of the superficial fascia. Wherever there's stillness, it's going to agglomerate. And so then that agglomeration is going to feel to you like a solid instead of a fluffy liquid or what have you. And so once she is using it, whatever we're doing, if it hasn't gone crystal and if it hasn't gone brittle, you can reclaim it. It sounds like she did. Good for her.
Gil, are you there?
Hello?
I lost you for a second.
Can you hear?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Did you get that speech?
Just the tail end of it. I missed the tail end of it there.
Oh, shoot. Anyway, I was basically saying that, if that you can, if the tissues are in stasis and you're not exercising differential movement in them, they're going to feel more dense, less movable, and that's going to be true in the muscle layer, in the tone of the muscle, in the tone of the deep fascia, in the texture of the filmy fascia, in the texture of the superficial fascia. The whole package is going to be an expression of the stillness, which can be changed. So those changes aren't just changes in filmy fascia. They're going to be changes in the nervous system. They're going to be changes in her emotional state. They're going to be changes in her relationship to herself that are representations of that not moving there, or the beginning to move there, and that excitement, and then the taking up the movement there as a life embodiment practice.
Absolutely. Well, it's great. It's so great to. I mean, we know this from people just changing themselves regardless, without connective tissue work from anybody, and how much the body can change with someone just taking a conscious effort of changing themselves. And that was what was fantastic about that quote unquote discovery, or my own personal aha moment of, this is fantastic, and how empowering that is for individuals to be able to know that you can actually change your fascia on your own without, mutilating it with foam rollers or Rolfing or not saying that Rolfers don't mutilate. Some do, but there's a lot of massage therapists that do as well, and physical therapists. So everyone's guilty to some extent, but it's a fantastic thing to be able to go inside your body and heal yourself. And that's what, for me, at that moment was so fantastic to see her just light up, and I'm doing great. And to check that tissue, and it's doing fantastic, because up until that point, from what I was taught, that wasn't really possible, so to speak.
Yeah, that is wonderful. And it's we can help each other move, or we can, in other words, we can take responsibility of ourselves by hiring someone to move our tissues. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's required, because we don't even know how to access ourselves in the early stages of self-embodiment connection, right? But once someone has helped you access yourself, well, then you're off and running, right? And you can take it up as your own way of feeling good, rather than waiting another week for your next session until someone moves you again. It's like an aha moment, I think. And she obviously had it when she realized, oh gosh, I can move myself.
Yeah, she came back to see me just because she just wanted to say hi. It was because she needed more of the work.
Yeah, well, with a practice like that, you'll be a taxi driver before you know it. In the best way, you know what I'm saying? In other words, we should all be working ourselves out of a job instead of creating dependencies.
I would love to put myself out of business. I would absolutely love it. To see a world with a lot less suffering would be worth every minute of putting myself out of business.
Yeah, and finally, you could get back to building a rocket to go to burn up in the sun with your car.
Because that's what life's all about, is putting a rocket in with your car.
Well,
it's fun, right?
For some people, it is. I mean, yeah. I mean, in other words, that's the beauty of different ways of being in the world, and different points of interest. And thank God there's a great variety, because if we all just wanted to put our car on Mars, it would be a problem. And if like nobody wanted to bake bread, the world would come to a grinding halt.
It definitely would. It definitely would. So, what's next for you, Gil?
I really contracted my my dissection schedule this year. My travel. Of course, I get many invitations. I've been brazenly turning them down. I feel bad, but I can't accept them all and get anything done. And so I'm kind of staying home, and I'm going to work on I spent the last month shopping like learning management systems so that I can have a sort of a robust delivery platform for the courses that I plan to develop. The first in line will be this one that I just toured, but I plan to put up many hours of curricular modules that I'm hoping people will take advantage of from an integral perspective. Basically, the anatomy that we've been using is borrowed. Our whole industry and many other industries have borrowed an anatomy from the medical establishment, which really isn't coherent with our perspective. And so I feel that I've developed a coherent perspective on the body that's from within our disciplines rather than borrowed from another. And it's just kind of my remaining task to get that down in a way that's usable and provides a good learning resource for people. And, it's not a lot about textbooks, and I think that the world is kind of moving past it. And since my work is very visually driven, I feel like, an online video driven course concept is one that I can use to convey, this whole story in an ongoing fashion online. So I'm working on that, as well as I have a number of books that are outlined and just waiting for me to sit down and write them.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, yeah. I'm really excited about when you get that information out. I will be more than likely signing up for whatever you produce, because I love your work. And
awesome. I appreciate it, Isaac.
Oh, you're welcome. Absolutely. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. So I think that we can go ahead and end the show now, just to be respectful of your time. I know you took time out of your busy day, to come talk with me on the phone here. Unfortunately, the video didn't work, and really, really appreciated you being on the show here with us. Would you like to have any last advice or inspirational quotes or anything that you'd like to say to the audience before we go ahead and go off the air?
Movement is life. Enjoy it. Why not?
That's awesome. So I'm going to put in the show notes everywhere that you can be located, so that people can find you and everything that you're doing. And that's
Thank
it
you
for
so
today, Gil. I really appreciate your time.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for being on the show.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching the Body Align Pro podcast. For more information, visit bodyalignpro.com. You can download the app for free on the Apple App Store. This podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. Be sure to check out the show notes for links. If you are enjoying this, please be sure to subscribe and share this with your friends and family. Once again, thanks for watching, and see you next time.